And joining us now in our Parliament House studio is Barnaby Joyce, Leader of the Nationals in the Senate and Opposition Spokesman on Regional Development, Local Government and Water. Barnaby Joyce, many thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Ali.
Before we get to the coal seam gas debate, as we just heard, the Greens are pushing for an inquiry in the Senate into both the decision to reopen Manus Island and also the Malaysian deal for asylum seekers. You're the Nationals Leader in the Senate, as I just said. Will you support the Greens on that call?
Well, let's see. With everything the Greens say, it's something else when you actually see the legislation. The Coalition didn't support the Malaysian deal. We supported Nauru. In fact, as soon as the Malaysian deal came out, I wrote an op-ed in the Canberra Times stating specifically what the issues were, the amnesty reports that had been out there. With the Malaysian deal, the Labor Party managed to do something that I thought was unique, and that is annoy both the left and the right side of politics, showing that in their belligerent views of trying not to say the word Nauru, they were willing to do anything, including sending people to a country which the amnesty report had shown that we had issues of people basically being sold into a form of slavery.
Is that a yes or no to supporting the inquiry?
Well, tell me what's in their piece of legislation, and I'll give you a response.
Well, it's not actually. It's not actually a piece of legislation at this point. It's just an inquiry into the facts. But I take your point. You can't make a decision now. Let's move on to the coal seam gas issue. Do you agree with Tony Abbott that if you don't want something to happen on your land, you should have the right to say no?
Well, not only that, it's the nation should be able to say no when it destroys an aquifer. There should be an immediate no. This is an issue that I don't think any party has got a problem with. In fact, it's peculiar to find out that Mr Emerson, who you just had on earlier, stating how outrageous Mr Abbott's position was, does he not realise that Mr Burke put up 300 conditions on coal seam gas? Now, that is his own government putting conditions on coal seam gas, so we seem to be on the same page here. If it's destroying prime agricultural land or unnecessarily interfering with prime agricultural land, that should also be a rule out. Now, we've also had today Anna Bligh putting a buffer zone of 2 kilometres from residential areas of 1,000 people or more. This is, I believe, by reason of the pressure that we have been placing on them. So there is another issue where there is movement already. And where those issues have been dealt with, Ali, I think it's very important that farmers get a fair deal. And what they're getting at the moment is less than 75 cents for every $1,000 that the coal seam gas company operates. And I think that is representative of the complete inequity in the dealing negotiations that are going on at the moment.
I want to ask you about compensation in a minute, but can I just clarify, under what circumstances do you believe a landholder should be able to say no?
Well, as I pointed out, if it's going to damage the aquifer, if it's going to destroy the aquifer, that is something that not only the landholder should have an interest in, but our nation should have an interest in. If it's going to destroy the usage of prime agricultural land, then that is something that not only the landholder should have an interest in, but our nation should have an interest in. And I heard your representative from the mining company before talk about how this would unnecessarily impede the mining companies. That is a load of rubbish. The history of this right to petroleum and gas is something that has not been going for hundreds of years. It started basically with the 1915 Act in Queensland to take the asset off the farmer and had it across to the states. In later guises, we see it through the 1930s from other states, and back to 1981, Neville Wran taking the last section of it from New South Wales. So it's not something that's been written in history like Magna Carta. In fact, if you want to go back to the common law principle, you will find that it's only silver and gold that is actually attached to the crown. Those things which were part of the soil were part of the land, and this was certainly coal and
Barnaby
oil.
Joyce, so your own resources spokesman, Ian McFarlane, he's pointed out, he says mineral assets belong to the people of a state, and he says, quote, "The moment we step away from a well-defined legal process, anarchy prevails."
Well, it's correct, they do belong to the state, but they belong to the state because the state basically pilfered them. Pilfered them in the guise of the way Neville Wran did it in 1981, pilfered them in the way that in 1915 in Queensland. By reason of the First World War, everybody felt that they had to secure the assets. But from my latest observation, the First World War is now over, but these assets were never given back.
But you're saying there's not a well-defined legal process?
Well, what I'm finding is quite obvious, that there's an inequity between the farmer's bargaining position and the miner's bargaining position, and that it's never better represented than the pecuniary return to the farmer, less than 75 cents and the coal seam gas operator getting $1,000. Now, if I said you get $1,000 or I get $1,000, Ali, you get 75 cents, do you consider that a good deal? Do you consider that a representation of a fair bargaining position? I presume you would say no. And I would say to the lady representing the mining industry, what's her consideration of that as a deal?
Well, let's go back to the reasons that you say that you'd be able to say no. Prime agricultural land and damage to aquifers. Do you know of any company on any project right now that would be able to say categorically for however many years out there'd be no damage to aquifers?
Well, this is a point of the Senate inquiry that we have at the moment, and that Senate inquiry will come to a conclusion later on in the year. A Senate inquiry which the extension of terms I got up, the National Party got up. It is looking into precisely this issue, and we hope at the end of that inquiry we have the capacity to bring together basically a sign-off from all parties involved so that we progress the issue. What the Greens wish to do, obviously, is play wedge politics. It's amazing how the Greens have managed to approach every media outlet with their position. They say they're going to contact me. I'm looking for a message on my phone. Haven't heard from them yet, and I won't because it's wedge. It's
Barnaby Joyce,
something for the theatre of media, not for the process of actually finding fairness.
But to go back to this point of being able to block access to land, if your inquiry finds that there are no guarantees about protection of aquifers, if your inquiry finds that there should be greater protection for prime agricultural land, what can you do to put in place restrictions? What's in your mind as a possibility?
Well, we've shown already with the movement from such people as Anna Bligh that the pressure from the inquiry is starting to have effect. I've heard Campbell Newman talk about the Golden Triangle and making sure it doesn't come onto prime agricultural land. We have brought this issue to the front of the agenda in Australia. That is something that I'm very happy is happening. It is something that we fought for. And what we can clearly say is there's not one party in Australia who believes we should be able to destroy aquifers. Even the Labor Party, despite the representations of Mr Emerson, who obviously doesn't know what his cabinet colleagues are saying, nor other people in cabinet, in the Labor Party cabinet, understand that even the Labor Party themselves put 300 conditions on the use of coal seam gas.
But Barnaby Joyce,
now,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are almost out of time. I'm just trying to understand.
Tony Jones's fault.
If you cannot get any guarantees about protection of aquifers, do you ban mining? Is that what you're proposing?
I think that all parties will be saying if we can't get protection of aquifers, that if aquifers are going to be destroyed, you won't have an argument in this parliament. I have not heard one person say that will allow mining companies to destroy aquifers, so you can say that it will be a unanimous
But what if
sign-off.
there's uncertainty, and given that you already have a massive industry that has been approved and has licences to operate in Queensland in particular?
Well, that's a very good question for Minister Burke. What is he going to do if they do destroy aquifers? Because he's given a condition that they have to make good. And how on earth can they do it? What do you do? Go down 900 metres and fix it up? How do you do that, Tony? I'll be fascinated to watch. You must have evolved into a mole.
Barnaby Joyce, many thanks for joining Lateline tonight.
My pleasure.